Perceptions of Phyllis Wheatley's work by Des Banks. Phyllis was named after the ship she was sold off, which her slaveholder's wife, Susanna Whitley, had given her in 1761. She had an angelic spirit that shined through her like the northern star, and it was very noticeable to the family. At a young age, she learned how to read and write English, then the Latin language by Whitley's daughter in 16 months, and grew interest in the Bible, English poets such as Alexander Pope, and so forth. Before the age of 21, Phyllis began to indulge in literary art by writing and publishing poetry with the support of Whitley's. In a letter written by Mrs. Whitley to the publisher, she wrote, as to her writing, her own curiosity led her to it. Having the opportunity to travel to England and cross paths with some of the most educated men in her time, Whitley's only book was also published. Whitley went on to become the first African American poet of either gender to be acknowledged for her works after confronting a committee of Harvard educators such as James Baldwin, who is a friend of Jefferson in 1780. Phyllis Wheatley Peters, now a wife and a mother of three, lived a freed life in poverty after the Whitley's death and died with an unmarked grave despite her accomplishments. My research question is, how did Phyllis Wheatley's literacy background shape her career and the way her work was received? I wanted to go into depth on whether other writers had taken her poetry as authentic and rather inspiring than inferior to the other race. It was stated in an article I read by Joelle Glad that she had crossed paths with Benjamin Franklin during her trip to London with her master in 1773. And in a letter he wrote to his son about his experience, he ended it by saying, I should have perhaps inquired him first, but I had heard nothing of him, and I have heard nothing since of her. Some may have agreed that Whitley's career was controlled by Whitley's based on this statement. And in relation to this interaction, Glad notes that she sparked significant awareness in his Declaration of Independence, speaking to the influence that Whitley's poetry had on the Black community. Although her poetry displays her identity as an enslaved Black girl who is gifted in literacy and perceives with a voice, some writers often question her position. Margie Podolsky expanded Henry Gates' lecture at the Library of Congress in March of 2002. Podolsky discussed Thomas Jefferson's debate on Black people not being originally intellectual compared to white people in her article. Jefferson argued that Whitley's work was imitative. In Podolsky's essay, Gates stated how this reaction created the tradition of African American literature dedicated to establishing their own freedom. Gates also explored the hot topic around Whitley's famous controversial poem on being brought from Africa to America. Reviewed by some of the modern writers as they referred to Whitley with racial slurs such as an early Boston ungemma. He urged for readers such as Amiri Baraka to avoid reviewing early influencers, write works with such standards, and that Whitley be perceived as an African American historian. These reactions displayed the confusion in Whitley's poetry by readers of color that could not relate to the significance in her career. Shannon Manuel compared Whitley to the movie Get Out and the idea of racial tolerance in her article, The Privileged and Impoverished Life of Phyllis Wheatley. She also stated that Phyllis Wheatley was a showpiece in the white community and a controversial figure in the Black community. In an article written by Nancy Chick, she dives into a more unique perspective behind Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. Significantly speaking on her spiritual beliefs, Chick writes in her own words that Whitley was an early voice for protest against slavery. And the reason for the start of African American literature tradition. It shows that Whitley has great influence on creating avenues for writers that came after her. In conclusion, I view Phyllis Wheatley to be one of the most influential early women writers I have yet to read upon thus far in my women's literature class. Although I taken although I had taken back by the poem, I find that her journey in spirituality and how the unfortunate event on being brought to America became a deeper meaning of her alchemy. To call her imitative, to call her work imitative is one of the delusion to her creativity, with being declined of equal education as men. Whitley created possibilities that opened doors for Black writers to establish their own voices. So to undermine her efforts in speaking up for slavery will be incorrect. Phyllis Wheatley was and forevermore today is a representation of excelling beyond your generalization. Perceptions of Phyllis Wheatley's work.